Marcus stood at the front of the church with his hands folded and his heart heavy as the quiet hum of whispers rolled behind him like a cruel tide. His wife's family filled the pews dressed in black, smiles hidden behind gloved hands and mocking eyes that never left his back. They laughed softly at his worn suit and his bowed head, and the way grief made him look smaller than the man they thought he was. What none of them knew was that the man in the casket had lived a life hidden behind silence and humility. And before the day was over, a single reading would turn every laugh into shock and every whisper into regret. Marcus Reed stood beside his father's casket as sunlight poured through stained glass windows, painting broken colors across the polished wood floor. The air inside the church felt thick and heavy, like every breath carried weight that refused to lift from his chest. He stared at the framed photograph of his father smiling gently in a simple suit, the same kind he had worn his entire life, never flashy, never loud, always reserved. Behind Marcus the pews were filled with his wife Denise's family, and their presence felt louder than the organ music echoing softly above. They sat together whispering and smirking, their eyes moving over Marcus like he was an object placed there for entertainment. Denise's mother Clara leaned toward her sister and shook her head slowly, her lips curling as if disappointment was something she tasted. "That is the man he came from," Clara murmured loud enough for those around her to hear. "All those years and nothing to show for it, another poor man buried with borrowed flowers." A few muffled laughs followed, and Marcus felt his shoulders tense, though he did not turn around. He had learned long ago that reacting only fed the hunger of people who needed to feel superior. Instead he focused on the memory of his father's voice, calm and steady, telling him that dignity was the one thing no one could take unless you handed it over. Denise sat 2 rows back, her eyes glued to her phone, her black dress immaculate, her expression distant. She had barely spoken to Marcus since arriving at the church, and when she did, her words were clipped and cold. To her family this funeral was not about loss but about confirmation that Marcus was exactly who they believed him to be. A man with nothing. A son of nothing. When the pastor stepped forward to begin the service, Marcus listened politely as prayers were offered and hymns were sung. Stories were shared about his father, Elias Reed, described as kind, hardworking and quiet. But even in those words the absence was loud, because no one spoke about success or achievement. That was the part of Elias's life Marcus had been taught to keep private. Elias had raised Marcus alone after his wife passed away, and had done so with strict discipline and simple living. They lived in a modest house, drove used cars, and never spoke of money beyond what was needed. Elias used to say wealth was loud when it wanted attention and silent when it wanted to grow. Marcus never questioned those words because his father had never given him reason to. As the service continued, Denise's brother leaned forward whispering to his cousin while nodding toward Marcus. "I still do not understand why she married him," he said. "Look at him standing there like a charity case." More laughter followed, and Clara placed a hand over her mouth pretending to hide a smile. Marcus heard every word but chose stillness because grief demanded more strength than anger. When the service ended, the congregation stood and slowly made their way toward the front to pay respects. Denise's family approached the casket with exaggerated sympathy, shaking their heads and sighing loudly. Some offered Marcus hollow condolences, others avoided eye contact altogether. Clara paused directly in front of Marcus and looked him up and down. "You did your best," she said with a thin smile. "Your father lived an honest life even if it was small." Marcus met her gaze calmly. "He lived a full life," he replied quietly. She scoffed and turned away, muttering under her breath, "If you say so." After the church emptied, Marcus remained behind, seated alone in the front pew. The silence that followed felt different, less sharp, more reflective. It was in that quiet that a man in a tailored dark suit approached, holding a leather folder close to his chest. "Mr. Reed," the man said respectfully. "I am Thomas Caldwell, your father's attorney." Marcus stood slowly, surprised but composed. "I was not aware my father had legal counsel," he replied. Caldwell nodded with a small knowing smile. "Your father was a very private man. He instructed me to meet you here today after the service." Marcus followed him into a small side room near the altar where sunlight filtered through narrow windows. Caldwell placed the folder on a table and opened it carefully. "Your father left specific instructions regarding his estate," he said. He requested the will be read in the presence of family at a time you deemed appropriate. Marcus felt a flicker of curiosity, but grief still anchored him. He had never known his father to own anything beyond the house and a small savings account. Still he nodded, trusting the man's professionalism. Caldwell continued. There is also the matter of immediate arrangements that require your signature. Several companies, foundations and financial institutions have been notified of Mr. Elias Reed's passing. Marcus looked up sharply. Companies, he repeated. Caldwell met his eyes calmly. Yes, Mr. Reed. Before Marcus could ask more, the door opened and Denise stepped inside. Her expression was impatient and annoyed. What is taking so long? She asked. Everyone is waiting and my family wants to leave. Caldwell turned toward her politely. Mrs. Reed, your husband is reviewing legal matters related to his father's estate. Denise crossed her arms. Estate, she echoed with a laugh. There is nothing to review. Caldwell said nothing, only closing the folder and offering Marcus a subtle nod. We can schedule the reading when you are ready, he said quietly. Marcus inhaled deeply. Tomorrow, he said. Here. Caldwell agreed and left the room without another word. Denise stared at Marcus, her eyes narrowed. Do not embarrass yourself, she warned. My family already thinks this whole thing is a waste of time. Marcus looked at her steadily. Tomorrow will be quick, he said calmly. She shook her head and walked away, heels clicking sharply against the floor. Marcus remained alone once more, his heart pounding not with fear but with the first hint of something unfamiliar. Anticipation. That night Marcus returned to the modest house he had shared with Denise for years. She went straight to bed without speaking while he sat in the living room surrounded by memories of his father. Photographs, books, handwritten notes filled with lessons and quiet encouragement. Marcus picked up a small notebook tucked inside a drawer. It was filled with his father's handwriting, meticulous and precise. On the first page were words he had read many times before. Silence is a shield. Patience is power. And truth always arrives on time. Marcus closed the notebook slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle into his bones. Tomorrow he would learn what his father had kept hidden. And tomorrow the laughter would end. Morning arrived slowly for Marcus Reed as gray light filtered through the curtains and rested on the quiet living room where he had spent the night sitting instead of sleeping. His father's notebook lay open on the table beside a cup of untouched coffee, and every word inside it echoed louder now that Elias Reed was gone. Marcus replayed every memory of his childhood, seeing moments he once thought were ordinary now glowing with hidden meaning and careful restraint. He remembered the nights his father would return home late with dirt still under his nails and calm in his eyes. He remembered how Elias never complained, never boasted, never explained where he went or who he met. He remembered being taught to listen more than speak and to never confuse noise with importance. Marcus dressed carefully that morning, choosing the same simple suit he had worn to the funeral because he felt no need to impress anyone. He was not walking into the church to prove himself, he was walking in to honor the man who taught him how to stand quietly while storms passed. When he arrived, the church was already filling with Denise's family. They gathered in small clusters, whispering and laughing as if yesterday had been entertainment rather than loss. Clara stood near the front, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp as she scanned the room like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. Denise joined her mother, adjusting her dress and leaning in close. I told him this was unnecessary, Denise whispered. There is nothing to inherit and nothing to read. Clara smiled confidently. Let him waste the time, she replied. Some people need ceremony to accept reality. Marcus entered without announcement and walked down the aisle alone. Conversations dipped briefly before resuming louder than before. He felt the stairs press into his back, but his pace never changed. Thomas Caldwell stood near the altar holding the same leather folder, now thicker than Marcus remembered. When he saw Marcus he nodded once with quiet respect. We can begin when you are ready, Mr. Reed, Caldwell said. Marcus turned to face the room. He looked at every face, including Denise and her family. He saw curiosity, mockery, boredom and entitlement all mixed together. "Let us begin," he said. Caldwell opened the folder and adjusted his glasses. He cleared his throat and began reading in a measured voice that filled the church. "I, Elias Jonathan Reed of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." Clara shifted slightly, folding her arms tighter. Her sister rolled her eyes audibly. "To my son Marcus Reed I leave all tangible and intangible assets under my sole ownership, including but not limited to properties, trusts, investment portfolios, corporate holdings and private foundations." The air in the church changed instantly. Whispers died mid-breath. Denise straightened her back. "Corporate holdings," Clara repeated under her breath. Caldwell continued without pause. "These assets are to be transferred immediately upon verification of identity and execution of legal documents already prepared." Marcus felt his chest tighten, but his face remained calm. He listened as though the words belonged to someone else. "Among these assets are controlling interests in Reed Maritime Logistics, Reed Infrastructure Group and Reed Capital Management." A gasp escaped someone in the third row. Denise's brother leaned forward, suddenly his grin gone. Caldwell turned a page. "The combined valuation of these entities at the time of writing exceeds $4.8 billion. The church erupted into noise. People stood halfway out of their seats. Denise's phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the pew. Clara's face drained of color. "That is not possible," she whispered. Caldwell raised his voice slightly. "Additionally, Elias Reed maintained private partnerships and silent investments in multiple domestic and international ventures." Marcus felt eyes burning into him from every direction. Some were shocked, others calculating, and some already fearful. Denise stood abruptly. "This is some kind of mistake," she said loudly. "My husband would have known." Caldwell turned to her calmly. "Mr. Reed was instructed not to know until this moment." Denise stared at Marcus, searching his face for confusion, but found only quiet understanding. For the first time since she had known him, she saw something else behind his eyes. Certainty. Caldwell continued. "Elias Reed also leaves his primary residence, the Reed estate, along with all surrounding land holdings, to his son." Clara stumbled back into her seat, gripping the pew. "The Reed estate," she repeated faintly. Marcus remembered every Sunday afternoon he spent mowing the lawn at that estate, thinking it was a caretaker job arranged by his father. He remembered being told to keep his head down and do the work well. The estate Denise's family bragged about living near. The estate they admired from a distance. Caldwell closed the folder gently. "This concludes the reading." Silence fell, heavier than any sound that had come before. No one laughed. No one whispered. Marcus turned slowly and faced the room. "I did not know everything my father built," he said calmly. "But I knew the kind of man he was." Denise took a step toward him. "Marcus, wait," she said, her voice shaking. He looked at her for the first time that day. Really looked. "You called this a waste of time," he said quietly. "You said there was nothing to read." Clara stood suddenly, her voice sharp with panic. "This changes nothing," she snapped. "You are still the same man." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "No," he replied. "You were just wrong about who I always was." People began murmuring again, but now the tone had changed. There was fear, respect, disbelief and desperation mixed into every sound. Denise reached for Marcus's arm. "We need to talk," she said. Marcus stepped back gently. "We will," he replied. "But not here." Caldwell approached Marcus discreetly. "The board members from Reed Infrastructure are waiting outside," he said. "They arrived this morning." Marcus nodded once. "Let them wait," he said. As Marcus walked down the aisle, this time no one laughed. They moved aside instinctively. Eyes followed him with awe and regret. Clara sank back into her seat, her authority shattered. Denise remained standing alone, realizing too late that the man she had belittled was never beneath her. Outside the church the sky had cleared. Sunlight touched Marcus's face, and for the first time since his father passed, the weight on his chest lifted slightly. Elias Reed had kept his promise. Truth had arrived exactly on time. Marcus stepped into the black sedan waiting outside the church, and for the first time in his life the driver opened the door and addressed him as Sir. The word felt strange but not heavy, and Marcus nodded quietly as the door closed behind him. The car pulled away slowly while the church faded in the mirror along with the stunned faces still frozen inside. Marcus watched Denise emerge onto the steps, her phone pressed to her ear, panic written across every movement. He felt no anger in that moment, only distance, as if a line had finally been drawn between who he was and who they believed he was. The driver spoke softly, asking if Marcus would like to go to the Reed estate or the downtown offices. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then chose the estate because some truths needed space and silence before business. As the car passed through the long iron gates, Marcus remembered riding his bike along this same driveway as a teenager. He remembered Elias watching from the porch, pretending to be just a caretaker while building an empire in the background. Now the weight of that sacrifice pressed into Marcus's chest with a new kind of gratitude. Inside, the estate staff stood lined in the main hall, their faces respectful but emotional. Many of them had known the truth about Elias but never spoken it out loud. They bowed their heads as Marcus entered, and one older woman wiped tears from her eyes, calling him young master under her breath. Marcus raised his hand gently. "Please," he said. "I am still Marcus." They smiled softly because they understood the man Elias had raised. In the study, Marcus opened the final sealed envelope his father had instructed Caldwell to give him privately. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink slightly faded but steady. "My son, if you are reading this, then you stood quietly long enough to hear the truth. I hid not because I was ashamed but because I wanted you free from the noise. Power attracts the wrong teachers, and I wanted your character to be shaped by work, not worship." Marcus sat down slowly as every word settled into him. "I watched them underestimate you, and I smiled because I knew you were learning patience. I watched them laugh, and I trusted you to learn restraint. When the moment came, you would not need revenge because truth would be enough." Tears blurred Marcus's vision, but he did not wipe them away. "Do not punish those who wronged you unless they force your hand. Let their regret teach them what your anger never could." Marcus folded the letter carefully and placed it in the desk drawer. The room felt fuller, as if Elias were standing beside him, nodding once in approval. A knock sounded at the door. One of the senior advisors entered cautiously. "Sir, the board members have arrived and the press is beginning to gather outside the gates." Marcus stood straight. "Let the board in," he said. "The press can wait." In the conference room, the men and women who had shaped industries rose to their feet when Marcus entered. Some had met him years ago without knowing who he was, and now recognition flashed across their faces. "You knew," one of them said quietly. "All this time?" Marcus nodded. "My father believed the work mattered more than the title." The room fell silent with respect. "We need your signature today," another said. "Without it the company collapses by the end of the quarter." Marcus took the document and read it carefully, even though he already knew its contents. When he signed, the room exhaled collectively. Reed Industries was saved. Across town, Denise sat in her mother's living room surrounded by family who now spoke in whispers instead of laughter. Clara paced the floor angrily, blaming lawyers, conspiracies, and Marcus himself. "He deceived us," Clara snapped. "He lied." Denise stared at the wall, her voice barely audible. "No. We just never listened." Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and friends, suddenly polite, suddenly respectful. The same people who had toasted her success now asked about her husband. Denise realized too late that she had stood beside a giant and mistook his silence for weakness. Back at the estate, Marcus stood at the window watching the sun lower over land his father had protected quietly for decades. He felt the responsibility settle into place, not as a burden but as purpose. The world was about to learn who Elias Reed truly was. And who Marcus Reed had always been. The morning after the funeral arrived with a quiet weight that settled over the Reed estate like a held breath. Marcus woke before sunrise and stood alone on the balcony listening to the wind move through the trees his father had planted decades earlier. Downstairs the advisors gathered again, not with urgency this time but with careful respect. Documents waited neatly stacked on the long table along with schedules, interviews and legal briefings that would reshape the public narrative by noon. Marcus listened without interrupting, absorbing every detail while keeping his hands folded just as Elias had taught him. When the final advisor finished speaking, Marcus nodded once and asked for one thing. "Bring them here." By mid-morning Denise, Clara and the rest of the family arrived through the gates escorted by security that once ignored Marcus entirely. Their footsteps echoed in the marble hallway, each sound heavy with uncertainty. Denise walked in first, her eyes red but focused. Clara followed, stiff-backed, pride-wounded yet not broken. Behind them trailed uncles, cousins and in-laws whose laughter from the church still rang in Marcus's memory. They stopped when they saw him standing calmly at the head of the room, not raised, not lowered, simply present. "This is inappropriate," Clara began, forcing her voice steady. "Family matters should not be handled like business meetings." Marcus met her gaze without hostility. "Then you should not have treated my grief like entertainment." "The room your family estate," Marcus continued, "was purchased outright 15 years ago by a holding company my father controlled. The debts were cleared quietly, the taxes paid, the staff retained. No rent has ever been charged." A murmur spread across the room. Marcus did not raise his voice. "I never used it. I never mentioned it. Because I wanted peace, not power." Clara's face drained of color. "You could have taken everything." Marcus nodded. "I still could." Silence fell heavy. Denise stepped forward, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "Respect. And distance." The advisors slid another document forward. "The trust that currently holds the estate will be dissolved by the end of the year. You will be given time to relocate and reorganize." Clara opened her mouth to protest but stopped when she saw Marcus's eyes, not angry, not cruel, but resolved. "This is not revenge," he said. "This is balance." Denise's shoulders shook as tears finally fell. "I thought you were weak," she whispered. Marcus looked away briefly, then back. "You mistook kindness for permission." Security escorted them out, not roughly, not harshly, simply final. The door closed behind them with a sound that echoed like punctuation in a sentence long overdue. Later that afternoon Marcus stood before a room filled with journalists, investors and community leaders. The story broke across screens within minutes. Elias Reed revealed as a silent architect of industries. Marcus Reed named sole heir and chairman. Questions flew but Marcus answered only what mattered. "My father believed wealth was most powerful when invisible. I intend to honor that." Across the city Denise watched the broadcast alone. Every word struck with clarity she had never allowed herself before. She remembered the nights Marcus came home tired and quiet. The times he paid attention instead of demanding it. The patience she mocked. Now the silence she faced was her own. At the estate Marcus walked into his father's study one last time that day. He placed the will back into the drawer beside the letter and closed it gently. Outside the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land. Marcus Reed stood no longer unseen. But still unchanged. The world had shifted. And the consequences had only begun. The days that followed moved with a strange calm, as if the world itself had decided to slow down and watch what Marcus Reed would do next. News vans parked outside the gates every morning while analysts argued on television about a man who had lived quietly and risen without warning. Marcus ignored most of it, choosing instead to sit in the same chair his father once occupied and read through handwritten notebooks filled with thought, strategies and reminders written in a careful, steady script. Each page revealed not just a businessman but a man who planned decades ahead, believing character mattered more than applause. One entry stood out more than the others. "Never punish with anger. Teach with clarity." That line followed Marcus into the next meeting, where representatives from the family company waited nervously in tailored suits. They had laughed once. They had whispered once. Now they stood. Marcus entered the room without announcement and took his seat at the head of the table. No speech followed immediately. He allowed silence to do the work. The chairman cleared his throat. We did not know who you were. If we had known. Marcus raised his eyes calmly. You would have behaved. That is the problem. He slid a single document forward. This company will survive because it deserves to. But leadership will change because culture must. Resignations followed quietly. Not forced. Understood. By afternoon the board was restructured and the headlines shifted from scandal to reform. Analysts called it ruthless. Employees called it relief. Across town Denise sat in a sparsely furnished apartment staring at her phone filled with messages she did not answer. Friends who once praised her now asked questions she could not face. She replayed moments she dismissed. The way Marcus never bragged. The way he listened. Her mother Clara fared worse. Invitations vanished. Doors closed. The same people who once laughed now avoided eye contact. At dusk Denise drove past the old estate and stopped outside the gates. Security recognized her instantly but did not open them. She stepped out and called Marcus's name softly through the iron bars. When he appeared on the balcony above she felt smaller than she ever had. Marcus, she said, her voice breaking. I know I do not deserve to ask. But I need to say I am sorry. Marcus did not move closer. He rested his hands on the railing and looked at her with quiet honesty. You are sorry for losing power. Not for losing respect. Denise nodded, unable to deny it. I did not see you. Marcus exhaled slowly. That was your choice. Silence stretched between them, heavy but clean. Finally Marcus spoke again. I will not punish you. But I will not save you from the consequences of who you chose to be. Denise cried openly then. Not loudly. Just truthfully. Marcus turned back toward the house. Goodbye, Denise. The gates remained closed. Weeks later Marcus stood before a crowd at a foundation launch bearing his father's name. He spoke not of wealth but of dignity. Not of revenge but responsibility. My father believed that the truest measure of a person is how they treat someone when they think nothing can come of it. The audience listened differently now. As the sun set Marcus returned to the study once more and placed a final item on the desk. A plaque bearing his father's words. Character outlives currency. Marcus Reed turned off the light and closed the door. The inheritance had been claimed. The lesson delivered. And the story was far from over. The final chapter did not arrive with noise or spectacle because Elias Reed never believed endings needed an audience. Marcus Reed understood that now more than ever as he moved through the days that followed with purpose anchored in restraint. The estate no longer felt like a symbol of wealth but a responsibility handed down with intention. Marcus walked the grounds each morning greeting staff by name, listening to their concerns and honoring the quiet loyalty they had shown his father for decades. He began restructuring the foundations Elias had built in silence, redirecting resources toward education, housing and small business development in neighborhoods that had been ignored by louder benefactors. There were no billboards, no galas, no public praise, only systems put in place to last beyond attention. Employees from the family company noticed the change immediately. Leadership meetings opened with listening sessions. Promotion criteria shifted toward integrity and consistency. Mockery disappeared because it was no longer rewarded. Marcus did not seek revenge against Denise or her family. He simply removed access. The distance became the lesson. Denise tried once more weeks later, sending a handwritten letter instead of a text. She wrote about regret, fear and the realization that she had confused dominance with strength. She admitted that laughter at the funeral would haunt her forever. Marcus read the letter carefully, then placed it in a drawer beside his father's notebook. He did not respond because some acknowledgments were complete without reply. Clara attempted to rally family members to reclaim relevance but found only quiet resistance. People who once echoed her tone now avoided it. The power she held dissolved without confrontation. Over time the story shifted in public memory. It was no longer about humiliation at a funeral. It became about a man who waited and a truth that arrived without force. Marcus was invited to speak at universities and leadership forums. He declined most but accepted a few where he spoke plainly about dignity and the danger of underestimating quiet people. He told students that wealth did not reveal character, it exposed it. In one lecture he shared a single memory. He described standing beside his father mowing the lawn at an estate others admired from afar. He said the lesson was simple. Work done without witnesses still mattered. The room fell silent. Back at the estate Marcus planted a new tree beside the old oak his father loved. He placed a small marker beneath it, not with Elias's name but with his words. Truth arrives on time. As seasons changed, Marcus continued building without noise. He invested patiently. He listened deeply. He corrected firmly when needed. The company stabilized, then grew. The foundations expanded. The culture endured. One evening Marcus stood alone on the church steps where laughter once echoed. The building was empty, now peaceful. He closed his eyes briefly, honoring grief that had transformed into clarity. He did not feel victorious. He felt aligned. Marcus Reed walked away carrying not just an inheritance but a standard. One that would outlive wealth. Outlast mockery. And speak louder than laughter ever could. The will had been read. Everything had changed. And the quiet man they underestimated had become exactly who he was always meant to be.